What is realistically the greatest threat to the USA? I'm also waiting for your opinion in the comments. What do you think is the biggest threat to the United States? Enjoy watching. Story 1. Currently, the GOP, specifically the U.S. Supreme Court, Donald Trump and his sycophants, including support propaganda from unfriendly foreign nations via social media. America falls from within, as all great empires do. But we can resist, defeat, and move forward to a better future by voting for those who will support the general public's best interests. Be sure to vote this November and send this message. We will not fall from within. We will not let you destroy this nation for your own self-centered aspirations. Story 2. There is a stupidly corrupt government ruling your country. All your wealth is based off thin air. The super rich are not paying their fair share of taxes. You cartel of corporations controlling your health that knows it's more profitable to keep you sick than to heal you. Your cities are being flooded with criminal and terrorist migrants that are being given anything they want whilst destroying your society. Your schools are promoting pedophilia. Your government is paying for a war on the other side of the world. You have a huge systemic racism program psyop being run against you, and you're concentrating on a conflict that has nothing to do with you. On the other side of the world, with people that have been at war for centuries and are never going to stop. If you're one of those people, you need a fucking reality check. Your house is on fire, and you're worried about what's going on somewhere else in the world. Story 3. The rapid and massive deterioration of American society. The homeless crisis, crime, and drug use will divert scarce resources to attempt to deal with this. Political divide and reluctance to agree on common solutions to worsening problems. Growing credit card, student loan debt are crippling young Americans. American cities are turning into ghettos countrywide. Income disparity and the huge divide between dwindling middle-class finances and the massive greed of hedge fund billionaires, corporate giants, and money-hungry business people. Story 4. The Pentagon has done numerous studies over the past 2 decades about this. They always find AI social media propaganda, in particular the effect misinformation can have on social cohesion, climate change, domestic terrorism, and outsourcing of manufacturing seared over extended supply chains to be huge threats to the U.S. that our elected government seems to be completely unwilling to address. I would add the potential for a pandemic many times worse than COVID and widespread economic mismanagement at nearly every level of society. But those are both consequences of misinformation. Story 5. The national debt is a massive threat that goes completely ignored because it's not an imminent one, but a slow killer. The larger it gets, the more of our taxes goes to paying off investors like China, rather than funding actual government programs like defense, infrastructure, etc. At some point, eventually all of our taxes will go to paying interest on debt, and we won't have any money to fund government expenditures. Every year we wait to address it. The more we need to both raise taxes, including on the middle class, and cut spending. But we have no term limits for Congress, and they need to get re-elected, so they make choices that are popular in the short term, even if they cost us long term. Failing to pay the debt, defaulting, would crash the global economy, and printing more money to pay it directly would cause hyperinflation. If you thought the past few years of inflation was bad, you haven't seen nothing. Hyperinflation is prices doubling every month. It's happened to many countries that tried to print more of its own currency to manage its debt. Story 6. Internal threats are the main danger to the U.S. There are things government agencies do that they will not even tell the president. Lots of unexplained deaths, provocateurs turning peaceful protests violent to turn the public against them. During the Vietnam civil rights movement era, there was a leaked FBI paper outlining how, through counterintelligence, it should be possible to pinpoint potential troublemakers and neutralize them. Yes, I did first hear that in a Rage Against the Machine song. Then I looked it up, and it's real. Jeff Epstein didn't kill himself. How many more suicides have been perpetrated by powerful people? Every time someone gets too close to exposing the truth, they are vilified, pilloried, or neutralized. Just look at Ed Snowden or Julian Assange. Story 7. It's subversive language and language techniques that can manipulate a narrative. It's pretty obvious, sadly, when people know what to look for in speech, behaviors, and other tactics. It's heartbreaking how badly it has been effective, and it's probably most effective today, with it continuing to worsen given information access and flow that overrides everyone's capacity. Story 8. Complacent ignorance and apathy. The amount of adults who have zero understanding of civics is unbelievable. The lack of concern or shame regarding that fact is appalling. At some point, someone will make moves to thwart the Constitution, and it will not only be accepted, but endorsed. So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. Padme Amidala. Story 9. A theoretical threat that scares the hell out of me is that any country with nukes could detonate in space, destroy most satellites, and essentially take us back to the Stone Age at any given time. If NK get their nuke program running well, they could give the middle finger to the world and just take everything out in theory. Problem with that plan is that they would then have the wrath of every single modern country coming down on them after the dust settles, if it settles. Story 10. Aside from internal, I want to say the cartels. An increasing number of them have American citizenship. Come here, have a kid, move back to Mexico and raise them. You now have a cartel member with American citizenship. They've been doing this for over a decade, and now moving north into the woods of California, rerouting water and starting illegal grow sites, not to mention the active urban warfare going on RN over fentanyl. China cutting into cartel. Cartel puts hits out on people buying fent online. Random dude in Chicago, or wherever, far from Mexico is my point, gets bumped off because he bought something online from China and cut into the cartel's business. It's easy as a name, sometimes a face, and a number. Green light. Over half of Mexico's economy is circulated through the cartels. The resort you stay at on the beach, those staff are paid by cartel, the resort owned by cartel, and you are safe because it is owned by the cartel. Tourism is big bucks. They have the numbers. They are paramilitary. Fun fact, we actually trained them. Trained 100 men to fight the cartels. They went and formed the most deadly one to date and effectively took over all the other ones. Gotta love it. And have a ton of wealth and influence. And they're expanding. Story 11. We for sure have many issues, but I believe China is our biggest concern. They are manipulating and controlling the U.S. citizens and politicians socially and politically. They are acquiring lands, materials, and resources to become the lone great economic power, ultimately controlling the world financial scene, all without firing a shot. They are also building their military and cyber capabilities, which will be hard to match due to the size of their population, production might, advancements in technology, and natural resources. Outside of Russia, they are the only major country looking to colonize sovereign countries. The U.S. has interests abroad, but the days of colonizing are long gone. Story 12. The oligarchy, EMO. We've seen the slow creep of corporate interest in the government for decades now, and the results speak for themselves. Low wages and a higher cost of living, inaccessible education and healthcare, declining birth rate and health outcomes, the largest prison population in the world, and a for-profit prison industry, and a higher wealth disparity than we've ever seen. The power structure must choose to exploit the majority of people in order to further enrich those with money and power, and in order to retain that power, our representatives rig the system by manipulating policies. Theoretically, this could all be solved by voting, but I think in practice it'd look a whole lot different. We've already seen how the electoral process has been corrupted by redistricting, gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and polling location accessibility. But we've also seen direct and willful refutations of the people's will. For example, Florida's citizens voted for a bill that should have restored the right to vote to non-violent felons. This should have been a huge win for Florida, as it has one of the highest incarceration rates in the U.S. and a huge population. After it passed, the state legislature mobilized to neuter the bill by stipulating that the felons' rights would be restored only if they paid off certain legal bills, which were obviously too expensive for any of them to pay. Is it any surprise that the legislature would go to such extremes when the prison system is for-profit, that they get paid more for a higher prison population, and when a disproportionate amount of those who would have had their rights restored are also minorities who might use their votes to vote for progressives or liberals? Even if we manage to vote in high enough numbers to not only voice our demands and overcome the policies that have been put in place to weaken our votes, the rules can still be changed if the establishment doesn't like what we voted for. To me, that is the death of America, when the people's voices are heard and then deliberately ignored because it lines someone's pocket. Story 13. United we stand, divided we fall. It's our own people forgetting that we are all American regardless of our views, /ethnicity/ political parties, beliefs. So many other countries hate on Americans. We don't need our own people being so hateful toward each other too. Story 14. Partisan politics. George Washington rightly warned us against the baneful effects of the spirit of party in his farewell address as President of the United States. Our broken plurality voting system encourages extremist candidates and discourages moderate, centrist candidates. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans want to change the system because the system got them into power. Switching to approval voting or single transferable voting or instant runoff voting would result in happier voters. but would put lots and lots of left-wing extremists and right-wing extremists out of power. Story 15. Realistically speaking, the biggest threat to the U.S. is the U.S. Let's look at it this way. China's direction is close proximity instead of distance. Prime example is Taiwan and the South China Sea, because the proximity to the mainland is reasonable and makes invasions cheaper compared to, say, sending an invasion to Hawaii because it's in the middle of the Pacific. Same thing applies with Russia. Even if both nations joined forces, there's no benefit to performing an invasion to the United States due to geopolitical reasons. Russia is close to Alaska, but there's no benefit in taking over a sparsely populated state compared to going for D.C. or even Los Angeles. And they have no valid reason for using nukes without the fear that it will be used against them too. ISIL and Al-Qaeda focus more on civilian casualties and symbolic destructions than dealing blows against leadership structures. They don't even have the personnel to conduct another kind of 9/11, at least in the U.S. In terms of geopolitics, Canada and Mexico has no benefits of becoming major threats to the United States, and Cuba's struggling horribly due to embargoes placed by the U.S. Never mind the cartels since they're in it for money, not for war. Now that's taken care of, I can go back to the United States itself. The reason I say the biggest threat is themselves comes in a lot of factors, but it stems from the three major structures: politics, dollar, and legality, which they all interact. Politics is straightforward. We have a Democratic White House and Senate, but a Republican House of Representatives. Under this session alone, the GOP has experienced a highly dysfunctional leadership within the House, due to the Freedom Caucus's unstable behavior that not only delayed electing a Speaker of the House, but also ousted them and couldn't even agree on the next leader. You also have state politics, where some states like Texas and Florida usurping and defying the federal government over issues that are handled by the latter alone. What I'm describing is a bunch of extremists have slowly taken over positions that influences policies and bills, the very same extremists that attempted to overthrow the election process back in January 6th. Dollar would refer to how it's the closest form of currency that can be treated as a world currency. Trading with dollars is how many parts of the world runs, and the one reason why. To buy U.S. treasuries or government bonds, which is considered the safest asset backed by the U.S. government, because it will never default. There's just one small problem with that. We've nearly defaulted in our national debt twice. Once back in 2013, and another last year because of the extremists. Yes, it was avoided, but this behavior caused the U.S. credit to downgrade twice for the first time in its history. Now, what would happen if the U.S. does default? That would be economically catastrophic for the world economy. But even more within the U.S., that would result in Venezuela/Zimbabwe tier inflation, astronomically high borrowing costs to combat inflation, massive cuts to government spending like social programs, and the overall erosion of individuals' wealth. Now let's say we've decided to go after the extremists to put a stop of them. Just round them up and lock them in a cell and throw away the keys. Sounds easy, right? That's where the legal aspect comes into play, especially when many of the extremists' movements are protected under the Constitution. For the best example, let's go with January 6th. For the most part, many charges against them have prevailed and went to prison, but there's also roadblocks to holding them accountable, and one of them's in the Supreme Court. Even if this isn't the case, one thing you'll likely notice is that majority of the rioters aren't charged with insurgency. They're charged with other forms of crimes like assaulting an officer. There's a foreign terrorist organization watch list, but there's no such thing as domestic terrorist organization watch list, though the FBI does consider sovereign citizens as the biggest threat to the United States. What I'm saying here is that either the U.S. doesn't have effective safeguards against domestic terrorism, or the system they have bears the risk of running afoul with courts. I know it's a lot to take in, so the TLDR version, unstable politics, unstable government finances, W/national debt, and domestic terrorism poses the biggest threat to the U.S. Story 16. Human overpopulation. Let me explain. More people, particularly in developed nations where we overconsume, means more environmental destruction. The Amazon rainforest is being destroyed to make room for beef cattle to give cheap beef to fast food places. People in the USA consume far more meat on average than people in 80% of the world, more than is needed. People in the USA have a huge carbon footprint. We use chemicals on crops that are somewhat risky to us and to bees. We are the driving force behind pollution in China because we buy shit from those factories and kill the oceans with importing ships and going on cruises. I could go on and on. Story 17. What I fear most besides the threat to our democracy such as Russia and China is definitely the growing threat of cyber warfare. This is not just about hacking and the threat of destroying critical infrastructure of the United States, but the other part of cyber warfare, where our adversaries are using various of tactics to manipulate and create an environment online where we're pitting against each other, dividing our country, spreading misinformation, and enabling violence. This is the Trojan horse that we are becoming aware of, but to fight this threat will require more action and attention. Story 18. The greatest threat today is the embrace of fascism by people who think that a strongman dictator who doesn't know about them or care about them will assuage their fears and lie to them that their tragic little lives are valuable in some way to the people who don't care about them and are more than willing to take advantage of their limited ability to think critically and understand the world at large. Story 19. WTF is wrong with you people? The answer is corporations. As entities, they have all the rights, all the agency, along with more power and influence than entire nations of people. They can't starve or bleed. They cannot feel pain or empathy. They only know infinite growth at all costs. They are a literal cancer on human society, and the source every existential threat we are facing as a nation and as a species. Story 20. Long-term like Rome, states becoming more individual, causing breakup. I could see the USA looking more like Europe in 100 years, made up of many small countries, possibly peacefully but unlikely. 50 years? Pretty stable but international meddling leading to WW3. There's so many international landmines that could trigger it. Taiwan, Middle East, Ukraine, and more. And that's just right now. I do think it's unlikely for WW3 to break out into total nuclear war, because that's the end. But the US and Russia fighting directly in Ukraine or China, and US fighting in Taiwan could happen in a way where neither country has a fear of direct invasion, so it's fought conventional. I do think that within the next 15 years we will have no choice but to have a direct war with either China, Russia, or both. Story 21. Climate change. Same goes for the rest of the world. We could nuke half the population and it still wouldn't do the amount of damage climate change could potentially do. A lot of people in wealthier nations think they have enough money to handle anything. Well, what happens if our coastal cities, where trillions in commercial, residential, ports, energy, etc. assets are flooded? What happens if densely populated regions near the equator become too hot to live, leading to mass migration? What if there are major crop failures around the world? This isn't just about the direct damage that climate change can cause. Even a bit of damage can have a chain reaction that leads to war, famine, economic disruption in the West, etc. What do people honestly think the war in Ukraine is about, when Ukraine is one of the largest wheat and fertilizer exporters in the world? There's a reason rich a-holes like Mark Zuckerberg are building bomb shelters on their properties, rich people building vaults up in here. There's a reason D-bags like Elon Musk want to escape to Mars. Oh, you think I mean to protect themselves from climate change? Ha ha ha. No. They want to be worshipped as heroes when shit starts going down, even if it goes down after they're dead. Elon Musk literally wants to be remembered and name-dropped like he was on Star Trek Discovery. Story 22. The United States government. Corruption is rampant. We have literal terrorists in government offices, libs of TikTok. Fascism and Christian nationalism are rising fast. They're passing laws that deny basic human rights to minorities and bodily autonomy to women. You have some states trying to legislate transgender people out of existence, and others passing sanctuary laws to protect them from, you guessed it, our own government. Story 23. Climate refugees. If people are complaining about the border now, just wait. I'm saying this as a lifelong Democrat. The U.S. will eventually have to post permanent troops on the borders, and I'm not sure if a rotation of National Guard troops will suffice. It's a nonpartisan issue. This is also the biggest problem facing Europe. The U.S. will need to make a deal with Mexico and help guard their southern border with bases and a heavy military presence. The sooner this gets rolled out, the better. Story 24. If Rome was an eagle, the United States is a phoenix. All empires through human history age and burn down, and typically a burn period gives opponents a chance to invade and ruin them. The U.S. is unique in that it has already burned down 3 to 5 times. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, crony capitalism in the early 1900s, the Great Depression. There are a bunch, depending on how you count. In most cases in history, any one of these would have been fatal to a nation's longer-term potential. To use a phrase from Harry Potter, I think that the next burning day for the United States will be quite the nasty one because it's been delayed for a generation. That doesn't mean it will be fatal, though. The biggest threat to the United States is when people draw a straight line from the present into the future, rather than understanding this cyclical trend of burning down and being reborn. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like it. Be sure to write comments and share your stories.